In a quiet little New England town, an abandoned Victorian mansion stands like a forgotten sentinel, lost in time. That's where the Holloway family, torn apart by loss and desperate for a fresh start, decides to move, lured by the ridiculously low price of the house. The patriarch Thomas sees this new place as a chance to move on from the grief of losing his wife and rebuild life with his 3 kids. But what seemed like a golden opportunity to heal old wounds quickly morphs into a waking nightmare. Whispers in the dark, shadows moving on their own, and secrets buried deep in the house's walls begin to haunt the family. As the Holloways dig deeper into the mansion's eerie mysteries, they face not just the ghosts of the past, but also a curse that threatens to tear them apart. This journey of discovery, trauma, and a jaw-dropping twist reveals that nothing is what it seems, and that the past has a way of creeping back into the present. The winding dirt road leading to Holloway House snaked through a dense forest of oaks and pines, their tall canopies barely letting any sunlight through. The trees, with their dry leaves whispering in the wind, seemed to clutch their secrets tightly, as if they knew the dark fate awaiting anyone daring to tread this path. Behind the wheel, Thomas Holloway kept his eyes on the road ahead, but he couldn't shake the growing unease that gripped him with every mile. In the back seat, his 3 kids were in various states of restless anticipation. 17-year-old Lisa stared out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the life they'd left behind. Her distant gaze reflected a silent resistance to the change her father was so eager for. Beside her, 12-year-old Emily bounced her legs impatiently, buzzing with curiosity about what their new house might hold. 8-year-old Andrew, the youngest, was leaning on Lisa, eyes half closed, fighting off the drowsiness from the long drive. "We're almost there," Thomas said, trying to sound upbeat, but his voice carried a tension that didn't go unnoticed by his kids. Lisa pulled her gaze away from the window, studying her dad for a moment, trying to read what was going through his mind. Suddenly, the house loomed between the trees, like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Holloway House rose before them, with its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky, the tall, narrow windows covered in a thin layer of dust and cobwebs. The once white exterior walls were now stained by time, with patches of crumbling plaster and moss creeping over large parts of the structure. A rusted, crooked iron fence surrounded the property, as if it was meant more to keep something in than to protect what was outside. Parking the car in front of the house, Thomas stepped out slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He walked toward the mansion with measured steps, his shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth covered in dry leaves. He was determined to turn this place into a home for his family, even though something inside him was screaming that this was a bad idea. Lisa was next to climb out of the car, followed by Emily, who immediately bolted toward the front gate. "Hey, don't go running off alone," Lisa called out, hurrying after her sister. But Emily was already ahead, driven by an inexplicable curiosity. "Check this out." Emily marveled at the decaying grandeur of the house. There was something about it that drew her in, a strange magnetism that made her feel like she belonged there. Lisa, on the other hand, felt a chill creep up her spine. There was something deeply wrong with this place, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. That made her uneasy. Andrew, still half asleep, dragged himself out of the car, rubbing his eyes. "Is this really our new house?" he asked, doubt clear in his voice. To him, the mansion looked like something straight out of one of those horror stories his older sister would read to him on stormy nights. "Yeah, Andrew, this is our new home," Thomas replied, trying to sound convincing. He knew this move was going to be tough for everyone, but he believed it was necessary to move past the grief that had hung over the family since his wife's death. This house, with all its space and isolation, seemed like the perfect choice for a fresh start. At least, that's what he hoped. Thomas opened the gate with a loud creak that echoed through the empty courtyard, disturbing the almost reverent silence that surrounded the mansion. The sound sent nearby birds fluttering away, as if fleeing from some invisible threat. Emily was the first to step through the gate, followed by Lisa, who hesitated with each step. When Thomas finally reached the front door and opened it, a rush of cold air escaped from inside, as if it had been trapped there for decades. He flicked on the flashlight he had brought, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a vast entrance hall with an ancient chandelier hanging from the ceiling draped in cobwebs. Furniture, still in place, was covered with sheets that had yellowed with age. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and the strong smell of mold invaded his nostrils, making him nearly cough. "Welcome to Holloway House," Thomas said with a forced smile, trying to mask his own apprehension. "It needs some repairs, but nothing we can't handle." Emily, unfazed by the oppressive atmosphere, was already exploring the space around her, running from one spot to another, eager to see what each door and hallway might reveal. "Look at this place. It's huge," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the empty hall. Lisa, on the other hand, slowly approached one of the walls, where a large mirror framed in carved wood reflected the distorted image of the room. When she looked at herself, she felt a knot in her stomach. She couldn't tell if it was the mirror's quality or the poor lighting, but something was off about her reflection. She blinked, and for a brief second, she thought she saw another figure standing beside her in the mirror, an indistinct shadow, undeniably there. Instinctively, she turned to look around, but no one was there. The scare sent her heart racing, and she backed away from the mirror. "You okay?" Thomas asked, noticing his daughter's sudden paleness. "Yeah, I think so," Lisa replied, trying to shake off the irrational fear that had crept into her chest. "This house is weird. It's just the size and the lack of light. It'll feel a lot more welcoming once we get things set up," Thomas assured her, trying to convince himself as much as her. Meanwhile, Emily had already found a staircase leading to the upper floor. The wood groaned under her feet, but she ignored the sound, too excited to care about the mansion's deteriorating state. Reaching the top, she found a dark hallway stretching in several directions, like a maze inside the house. Without hesitation, she picked one of the paths and started exploring. The bedrooms were dusty, with old furniture covered in more sheets and the windows shut, blocking out the daylight. At the end of the hallway, a smaller door, almost hidden behind a wardrobe, caught her attention. Emily pushed the wardrobe aside with some effort and opened the door with a creak that echoed through the house. She found herself in a small room, a makeshift attic, full of old junk. Dusty books, boxes, and various objects were scattered all over the place. There was a window high up, through which the evening light filtered in, partially illuminating the space. Emily felt a familiar thrill at the thought that she had discovered something hidden. In the center of the room, on an almost forgotten shelf, was a diary. The leather cover was worn, and the name Abigail was engraved in now faded gold letters. Emily picked up the diary carefully, as if it were a delicate treasure, and felt a strange sense of déjà vu. As she opened the first page, she found the neat handwriting of someone who had lived there long ago. "My dear Abigail," Emily whispered to herself as she began to read the first words. However, as she flipped through the pages, the diary's content began to change. The words, initially soft and hopeful, grew darker and more disturbing. Abigail wrote about a growing sense of despair, of being watched, followed by something she couldn't see but knew was there. "They are everywhere. I can feel their eyes on me, even when I'm alone. This house isn't safe." Emily stopped reading for a moment, feeling her heart beat faster. She glanced around, at the shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. The room, once just dusty and old, now felt suffocating, full of an invisible presence that pressed in on her. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze brush past her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She looked at the window, which was closed. There was no way the wind could have gotten in. She clutched the diary tighter, terrifying thought crossing her mind. What if Abigail was still there, somehow trapped in that place? "Emily? Where are you?" Thomas's voice echoed through the house, snapping her back to reality. She quickly closed the diary, tucking it under her arm, and hurried out of the attic, heart pounding. "I'm here, Dad," she called, trying to keep her voice steady as she rushed down the stairs. When she reached the ground floor, Thomas was in the entrance hall, still trying to mentally organize the mess they would need to clean up. He looked at her with a mix of concern and relief. "Don't wander off like that, okay?" "Sorry, I was just exploring," Emily replied, still slightly breathless. I'm glad you're excited, but this house is way too big. We could get lost if we're not careful, said, half joking, but there was an underlying seriousness in his words. He didn't like the idea of any of his kids getting lost in that vast, empty place. Lisa, who was still in the hall, eyed her sister suspiciously. What did you find up there? She asked, noticing the different look in Emily's eyes. Nothing much, Emily answered quickly, hiding the diary behind her back. And Andrew, still fighting off sleep, finally joined his sisters, clutching Lisa's hand. This house is scary, he said, his big eyes betraying a fear he couldn't hide. It's not scary, it's just different, Emily said, trying to sound convincing, both to Andrew and herself. Meanwhile, night was beginning to fall outside, and Holloway House seemed to change as the shadows deepened. The interior, already dark, became even more oppressive. Thomas decided it was time to start getting the rooms ready for the night, lighting a few candles he found in one of the boxes they had brought. Flickering light cast ghostly shadows on the Holloways' faces, making the dark walls dance in an unsettling way. Let's pick our rooms and then grab something to eat, Thomas suggested, keeping a practical tone. Tomorrow, we'll start getting everything in order. The bedrooms, though large and well decorated, were soaked in a sense of abandonment. Each of the kids picked one, but Lisa hesitated when entering what would be hers. The canopy bed with velvet curtains was perfectly made, as if someone had been waiting to lie there. The fireplace in the corner had ashes that seemed fresh, which was odd for a house that had been abandoned for so long. She couldn't shake the feeling that the room wasn't empty. Emily, however, seemed captivated by the room she chose. It was smaller than the others, but it had a window that overlooked the back garden, where a small, ivy-covered fountain stood. The decor was simple but cozy, and the faded floral wallpaper gave the room a melancholic vibe. As she lay on the bed, still holding Abigail's diary, she felt an odd familiarity, like she had been there before. While everyone was settling in, Thomas decided to check out the basement. He knew if the house had any structural issues, they'd probably be down there. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs leading to the basement, where the darkness seemed even thicker. The smell of mold and damp earth was strong, and the stone floor was cold under his feet. When the flashlight beam illuminated the space, he saw that the basement was vast, with several rooms, as if it had been used for multiple purposes over the years. As he explored, he found what looked like an old altar in one of the farthest rooms. It was made of stone, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Melted candles and dark stains on the floor suggested it had been used recently. Thomas felt a chill, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just part of the house's history, something insignificant, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Back upstairs, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what she had read. Sitting on the bed with the diary open in her lap, she continued reading, even though the dim candlelight made it hard to see. As Abigail's words delved deeper into despair, Emily felt as though the weight of the events described in the diary was materializing around her. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew heavier, and the sense that something terrible was about to happen was almost palpable. Lisa, however, couldn't sleep. Whatever had been bothering her since they arrived at that house only intensified as the night wore on. She heard whispers, like indistinct voices coming from all directions. No matter how hard she tried to ignore them, they persisted, and the more she focused on them, the louder they seemed to become. When she couldn't take it anymore, she got up and left her room, determined to find her dad. Opening the door, she was met with something that made her freeze. At the end of the hallway, a female figure stood, her face hidden in the shadows. Lisa felt her heart stop for a moment, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Trying to stay calm, she ran to Thomas's room and knocked hard on the door. Thomas opened the door quickly, startled by the panic on his daughter's face. "What is it, Lisa?" "What happened?" I think I saw someone," she said, her voice trembling. "It was probably just your imagination, sweetie. This house is old, full of shadows and noises. Let's go back to your room. I'll stay with you until you fall asleep," Thomas said, trying to reassure her, though he himself was feeling increasingly uneasy. As he walked her back to her room, they both heard a sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like crying, soft and distant, undeniable. Thomas stopped in the middle of the hallway, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Lisa clutched his arm tightly, her fear now fully evident. "I heard it," she whispered, confirming she wasn't crazy. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." Carefully descended the stairs, flashlight in his hand trembling slightly. The sound seemed to come from the living room, where the old windows were softly rattling in their frames. When he entered the room, the crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind and the rattling windows. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing through the empty room. But there was no answer. He shined the flashlight into every corner of the room, but found nothing out of place, just the heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill the house. When he returned upstairs, Lisa was still standing in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard it, Dad. I swear I did." "I know," he said softly, hugging her. "Let's try to get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll take a better look at this house." But sleeping that night would be nearly impossible. Crying, the whispers, and the shadows were just the beginning of something much more sinister. Something the Holloway family didn't yet understand, but which would soon reveal itself in all its terrible glory. The night dragged on slowly in Holloway House. Every minute felt like hours, with the darkness wrapping around the house like a suffocating shroud. While Thomas tried to comfort Lisa and Emily, struggled against the growing terror the diary instilled in her. Something much deeper and more sinister began to manifest in the bowels of that old house. In the living room, Thomas lit more candles, trying to brighten the room with a warm light that barely pierced the thick shadows dancing on the walls. The heavy silence was broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the distant sound of the wind whipping through the trees outside. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, grew stronger with each passing moment. "Lisa, try to rest," Thomas urged, as Lisa curled up in a chair near the dead fireplace. She looked at her dad with wide eyes, her body trembling slightly. The vision of the figure in the hallway was still fresh in her mind. "I can't, Dad. I feel like there's something here. Something that doesn't want us to stay," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Thomas could respond, a deep sound reverberated through the house, like a distant moan. It wasn't the crying they had heard before, something more primal, laden with an ancient pain that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Emily, who was at the top of the stairs, reading Abigail's diary by the weak light of a candle, felt the floor tremble slightly. She stopped reading and looked down at where her father and sister were. "Dad, did you hear that?" she asked, her voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Yeah, I heard it," Thomas replied, now clearly concerned. Something was definitely wrong in that house, and he could no longer ignore it. The sound reverberated again, this time louder and closer. It seemed to come from deep within the house, maybe the basement, where Thomas had found that strange altar earlier. He knew he needed to check it out, but fear paralyzed him. Still, he couldn't let his kids see his hesitation. "Stay here. I'll take a look," he said, trying to sound firm, but Lisa clung to his arm. "Don't go alone," she pleaded, her eyes filled with fear. "I have to see what's going on," Thomas insisted, but the truth was he was scared too. Something was pushing him forward, an invisible force he couldn't resist. He descended the stairs slowly, each step heavy with the growing tension. The sound was now clearer, an ominous moan that seemed to crawl along the cold stones of the basement. When he finally reached the basement door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the rusty doorknob. Upstairs, Emily couldn't take her eyes off the diary. Abigail's words were becoming increasingly chaotic, almost scribbled, as if she had written in a frenzy. "They found me. There's no escape. The sacrifice must be made. The curse must go on, or we're all doomed." Emily felt the air around her grow thick, hard to breathe. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe, almost as if they were taking shape. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A pale figure with long dark hair stood in the corner of the room, eyes fixed on her. Emily blinked, and the figure was gone. Cold in the room remained. "Lisa! Dad!" Emily screamed, running towards the stairs, still clutching Abigail's diary to her chest. Something terrible was about to happen, but she knew she had to warn them. In the basement, Thomas finally mustered the courage to open the door. Cold, damp air wafted up from the depths, carrying the smell of earth and decay. The flashlight's beam shook as he descended the stone steps, each step echoing in the cavern of darkness below. The moan grew louder, now so close he could feel it vibrating in his bones. When he reached the bottom, the flashlight illuminated the altar once more. But now, around it, Thomas saw something that hadn't been there before. Figures, carved in stone, representing otherworldly beings with faces twisted in agony. He approached the altar, unable to tear his eyes away from the figures. There were fresh bloodstains on the stones, as if some ritual had been performed there recently. But before he could process what he was seeing, the moan turned into a scream, and an invisible force slammed him against the wall, knocking the flashlight from his hand. In the darkness that followed, Thomas tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions. He felt something tighten around his throat, an invisible hand slowly choking him. Desperate, he struggled to break free, but the pressure only increased. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, the sound stopped abruptly and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Upstairs, Emily and Lisa felt the house shake as if it were alive. The walls seemed to pulse and the windows vibrated with an unseen force. Emily rushed to the living room where Lisa was waiting, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," Lisa shouted, but Emily held her back. "We can't leave Dad," Emily cried, desperate. But before they could decide what to do, the front door slammed shut with a loud bang, as if something or someone had locked it from inside. The lights in the house flickered and went out, leaving them in complete darkness. In the basement, Thomas struggled to catch his breath, but something was horribly wrong. The altar before him began to glow with a pulsating red light, and he heard voices whispering around him, voices that weren't human. He tried to get up, but felt something cold and slimy grab his ankles, pulling him toward the altar. Desperate, he fought against the invisible force, but it was useless. He felt his body being dragged to the altar, where he was forced to lie down. The voices around him began chanting in an unknown language, and the altar glowed even brighter, as if it were alive. "No, let me go," Thomas shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the increasingly loud chant. In the darkness, Emily and Lisa felt the house contort around them. The walls seemed to move, and the doors slammed on their own. A low, evil laugh echoed through the hallways, as if something unseen was enjoying their despair. "We have to find Dad," Emily yelled, pulling Lisa toward the basement. "No, Emily. Something's really wrong down there." Lisa tried to resist. "I know, but we can't leave him," Emily insisted, and with Abigail's diary clutched tightly in her hands, she descended the stairs, reluctantly followed by Lisa. When they reached the basement, a red glow from the altar was visible even before they descended the last step. What they saw below made their hearts stop. Thomas lay on the altar, bound by invisible chains, while the red light enveloped him. "Dad!" Emily screamed, rushing toward him. As she approached, an invisible force threw her back, slamming her against the wall. Lisa screamed and tried to reach her father. The same force stopped her, throwing her beside her sister. Voices around the altar grew louder, and the red light began to focus on a single point, directly above Thomas's chest. He screamed in pain as something began to manifest. A shapeless, horrifying form made of pure darkness. "Emily, the diary," Lisa shouted, trying to get up. Emily, still dazed from the fall, looked at the diary beside her. Abigail's words were burned into her mind. The sacrifice must be made, the curse must go on. She knew what was happening here was the continuation of the same ritual Abigail had witnessed centuries before. She grabbed the diary and frantically flipped through it, searching for some way to stop this. Before she could find anything, the dark figure above the altar began to take shape, manifesting into a grotesque entity, eyes glowing a fierce red. "No, we won't let this happen," Emily shouted, and in a desperate act, she tore the pages from the diary, throwing them into the air. The effect was immediate. The voices stopped, and the figure above the altar faltered, form flickering. But this also enraged the entity, which let out a terrifying scream and charged at Emily, slamming her to the ground with brutal force. Lisa rushed to her sister, desperate. "Emily, wake up, please." But before she could do anything else, the altar began to disintegrate, and the entire house shook violently, as if it were collapsing. Red light vanished, and darkness engulfed everything. The basement walls started to crack, and chunks of stone fell around them. Final effort, Thomas broke free from the invisible chains, rolled off the altar. "We have to get out of here, now!" shouted, grabbing Lisa and the still unconscious Emily. They ran toward the stairs as the basement crumbled behind them. Floor shook violently, and the house's walls twisted, as if they were alive. Thomas pulled his two daughters up, and with one last push, they made it out of the basement and back upstairs. The house wasn't ready to let them go. The doors slammed shut violently, and the windows exploded in a shower of glass, slicing through the air with sharp fragments. Dark figure they thought they had destroyed now manifested in the living room, growing until it filled the entire space. It let out a scream that made the floor tremble, and the candlelight flickered and died. Thomas pulled his daughters toward the front door, but it was locked tight as if something was holding it shut. "Come on, get out," he shouted, pushing the girls through the door. With tremendous effort, Lisa and Emily managed to pry the door open, and the family bolted outside, leaving Holloway House behind. When they were at a safe distance, they saw the house shake violently, walls cracking and collapsing in on themselves. The dark figure appeared one last time, letting out a scream of pure rage before the house crumbled completely, burying it in the ruins. Thomas, Lisa, and Emily collapsed on the ground, exhausted, as they watched Holloway House turn into a pile of rubble. Terror was finally over, but the price they paid was steep. Emily, still clutching the remnants of Abigail's diary, looked at the ruins with a vacant stare. She knew that despite their escape, the curse of Holloway House still persisted, buried deep in the earth, waiting for the moment when it could return to claim new victims. The days following the collapse of Holloway House were shrouded in disbelief and silence. Thomas, Lisa, and Emily were taken in by town residents. There was a cautious distance between them and others. The story of the house and its destruction spread quickly. Few believed what had actually happened. While Lisa and Thomas tried to move on, it was Emily who bore the brunt of what they had experienced. She spent hours staring at the remains of Abigail's diary, trying to understand what really happened and whether somehow she could have done something differently. One night, as the family tried to start over in a small rented house, Emily heard a familiar sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to make her heart race. It was a whisper, coming from the attic. She hesitated, fear growing inside her, but an unknown force compelled her to investigate. Climbing the stairs silently, she found the attic bathed in a faint, almost ethereal light. And there, in the center of the room, was a small wooden box she hadn't seen before. With trembling hands, she opened the box and found a single page from Abigail's diary that had survived the destruction. The words on it were clear, as if they had been written that very night. Curse was contained, not destroyed. Whoever dares to awaken what is buried in Holloway House will bring the darkness back. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that somehow what remained of the mansion still held terrible secret. And if anyone, someday, decided to explore the ruins, the cycle of terror would begin again. She knew her life and that of her family would never be the same. And as the lights in the house flickered and the night deepened, Emily heard, in the distance, a familiar whisper, like a promise that the darkness would never truly be contained.